eyes may be able to see, but without a heart, you cannot feel.
What's up, everybody? This is Socio-Economic, and you are tuning into episode 98 of the It Will Come Show. And today we're going to be talking about the game of Monopoly and the socio-economic influence on community health over time. And of course, this is actually related to what we're seeing in the world right now in regards to the protests. And it's crazy, and if you just track sort of the point in time in which I rebooted this show, we started off with the pandemic, COVID-19, talking about economics, and now we are seeing sort of the next phase, which is protests, riots, etc. So let's dive straight in. So, Monopoly. Are you familiar with the game of Monopoly? Would love to hear. But this here, the reason why I'm showing this is because this game is so reflective of actually the reality within our current economic global society. And the game of Monopoly, if you've ever played the game, is actually quite... If you are essentially on the winning side, you feel great. If you're on the losing side, it really sucks. And not only that, over time, if you play the game long enough, right, you just see how much of a monopoly sucks. But it's very fascinating to see that even though we call today's society, or we aim to have a free market in a capitalist society, there are actually quite a lot of monopolies that get formed over time. And so what I want to share with you is how this actually translates to what we're seeing in the sort of people physical form and aspect, the influence of economics on the social side of things. All right. So, but what I'm actually going to do first is share a video that was passed to me again that I saw via Instagram. And it was very pertinent, and so I want you to have a listen. Now, let me know if you can or cannot hear this video when I play it. But
I've been seeing a lot of things talking of the people making commentary. Interestingly enough, the ones I've noticed that have been making the commentary are wealthy black people making the commentary about we should not be rioting, we should not be looting, we should not be tearing up our own communities. And then there's been an argument of the other side of we should be hitting them in the pocket. We should be focusing on the blackout days where we don't spend money. But I feel like we should do both. And I feel like I support both. And I'll tell you why I support both. I support both because when you have a civil unrest like this, there are three types of people in the streets. There are the protesters, there are the rioters, and there are the looters. The protesters are there because they actually care about what is happening in the community. They want to raise their voices, and they are there strictly to protest. You have the rioters who are angry, who are anarchists, who really just want to fuck shit up, and that's what they're going to do regardless. And then you have the looters. And the looters almost exclusively are just there to do that, to loot. Now, people are like, well, what did you gain? Well, what did you get from looting? I think that as long as we're focusing on the what, we're not focusing on the why. And that's my issue with that. As long as we're focusing on what they're doing, we're not focusing on why they're doing. And some people are like, well, those aren't people who are legitimately angry about what's happening. Those are people who just want to get stuff. Okay, well then, let's go with that. Let's say that's what it is. Let's ask ourselves why in this country in 2020, the financial gap between poor blacks and the rest of the world is at such a distance that people feel like their only hope and only opportunity to get some of the things that we flaunt and flash in front of them all the time is to walk through a broken glass window and get it. That they are so hopeless that getting that necklace, getting that TV, getting that change, getting that bed, getting that phone, whatever it is that they're going to get, is that in that moment when the riots happen and if they present an opportunity of looting, that's their only opportunity to get it. We need to be questioning that why. Why are people that poor? Why are people that broke? Why are people that food insecure, that clothing insecure, that they feel like their only shot, that they are shooting their shot by walking through a broken glass window to get what they need. And then people want to talk about, well, there's plenty of people who pulled themselves up out of bootstraps and got it on their own. Why can't they do that? Let me explain to you something about economics in America. And I'm so glad that as a child, I got an opportunity to spend time at Push where they taught me this, is that we must never forget that economics was the reason that black people were brought to this country. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Do you understand that? That's what we came to do. We came to do the agricultural work in the South and the textile work in the North. Now, if I right now decided that I wanted to play Monopoly with you, and for 400 rounds of playing Monopoly, I didn't allow you to have any money, I didn't allow you to have anything on the board, I didn't allow for you to have anything, and then we played another 50 rounds of Monopoly, and everything that you gained and you earned while you were playing that round of Monopoly was taken from you. That was Tulsa, that was Rosewood. Those are places where we built black economic wealth, where we were self-sufficient, where we owned our stores, where we owned our property, and they burned them to the ground. So that's 450 years. So for 400 rounds of Monopoly, you don't get to play at all. Not only do you not get to play, you have to play on the behalf of the person that you're playing against. You have to play and make money and earn wealth for them, and then you have to turn it over to them. So then for 50 years, you finally get a little bit and you're allowed to play. And every time that they don't like the way that you're playing, or that you're catching up, or that you're doing something to be self-sufficient, they burn your game. They burn your cards. They burn your Monopoly money. And then finally at the release and the onset of that, they allow you to play and they say, okay, now you catch up. Now at this point, the only way you're going to catch up in the game is if the person shares the wealth, correct? But what if every time you share the wealth, then there's psychological warfare against you to say, oh, you're an equal opportunity hire. So if I played 400 rounds of Monopoly with you and I had to play and give you every dime that I made, and then for 50 years, every time that I played, if you didn't like what I did, you got to burn it like they did in Tulsa and like they did in Rosewood, how can you win? How can you win? You can't win. The game is fixed. So when they say, why do you burn down the community? Why do you burn down your own neighborhood? It's not ours. We don't own anything. We don't own anything. Trevor Noah said it so beautifully last night. There's a social contract that we all have, that if you steal or if I steal, then the person who is the authority comes in and they fix the situation. But the person who fixes the situation is killing us. So the social contract is broken. And if the social contract is broken, why the fuck do I give a shit about burning the fucking Football Hall of Fame, about burning a fucking Target? You broke the contract when you killed us in the streets and didn't give a fuck. You broke the contract when for 400 years we played your game and built your wealth. You broke the contract when we built our wealth again on our own, by our bootstraps in Tulsa, and you dropped bombs on us. When we built it in Rosewood and you came in and you slaughtered us. You broke the contract, so fuck your Target. Fuck your Hall of Fame. As far as I'm concerned, they could burn this bitch to the ground. And it still wouldn't be enough. And they are lucky that what black people are looking for is equality and not revenge.
Woo! Right? So, damn. You know, that video was pretty powerful, and I've seen quite a few powerful videos come out over the last week, especially as the riots have been happening and whatnot. Actually, I'll share a few other things. Even one of my buddies, Michael Hudson, who's the CEO of BitStocks, he shared one that was very interesting. It was an interview between David Icke and a shaman from South Africa, who is considered to be one of like the last remaining, he's passed away now, one of the last remaining elders who knew the history of Africa, you know, before the history textbooks were rewritten and things omitted. But, you know, looking at this, right, the analogy she gave of Monopoly I thought was a very apt one, because A lot of people are familiar with the game of Monopoly, and I know that, like, yeah, it's great when you're actually winning in Monopoly and you're able to monopolize everything, but you can see just how much inequality and how much emotional reactions you can get out of people for those who are on the losing side, right? And I think what she said, about the 450 rounds, right? And the 400 of those 450 rounds being essentially, the wealth being built on the back of slaves. And if you actually look into ancient Egypt, it's quite fascinating, right? It seems like a lot of these empires actually built on the backs of free labor, essentially, that were forced. And if you look back to ancient Egypt, it was a similar thing there, right? Slaves were also used to be able to build the great empire of Egypt. And we see this play out again, technically, with the United States. And so whenever you hear people talk, and again, I am for the idea of capitalism and a free market, but the irony is a lot of capitalism seems to have been built on the back of things like slavery, right? The United States was built off of it. And it makes you think about, well, if it was built off of that, how much of those sort of practices that were inherently there at the beginning brought over into modern day business practices. And I think technically you could probably see a correlation between those practices and what we actually see in corporations too. Within corporations, a lot of analogies are made for worker bees as being sort of the modern slaves, right? A lot of people who, yes, they might be paid, but the sort of practices in which they are treated, right, as potentially numbers or not worth much is very, very common. And so I wanted to touch on that in terms of this correlation between, the economics, the social side, the socioeconomics, and how that actually impacts community health over time, right? Because as if you've been following my show, I'm very much into looking at the building of communities, and I do that for a living as well, for businesses. But you have to understand, right, that there are some conflicts or tension between what a community wants, and in order for it to be healthy, and then the needs of a capitalistic setup or society, right? And just the needs. So let's go back in. So, very quickly, I wanted to just sort of touch on the evolution of money. If you go back to some of my past episodes, actually do dive in a little bit more deeply into money itself and its evolution. But here's what we can currently see, right? In the very early days, we had barter. And barter was essentially a form of exchange, a form of trade, whereby, if I had something of value to you, and I had cows and you had, I don't know, crab shells, then we would just negotiate between each other, accepting that, we actually do want each other's things. How much of my cows is the equivalent of your crab shells or something of the sort, right? And then, that works, I think, in very smaller groups. But, as smaller groups started to think about, growing their presence and conquering and what have you, at scale, the scaling problem or issue is actually what forced us to move from barter as a form of exchange to something like gold, right? As you know, barter, using cows and crab shells, like, it's highly variable, it's very subjective. You can't actually get sort of an equal standardization, right? So then came in gold. Gold was something that was finite. It was something that was of perceived value to many other people, and but yet it also had some issues, right? Gold, in terms of the form in which that it was brought out, wasn't very transportable or portable. So then things like metal coins came out. And so in the early days, these metal coins actually were, either full gold or full silver. But then what happened over time, if you look at the history of the Roman Empire, with the Roman Empire, they did the equivalent of what we're doing right now. So right now, if you look at what many governments have done, is that they printed money, right? But by printing more money, they're diluting the value of their paper money, the currency. And so in Roman times, the equivalent of what we're doing now back then was they actually diluted the gold and silver coins with things like copper and other metals. So essentially, the coins that you were carrying around, the value actually was lessened because I guess the people who were managing everything, they started to dilute it, right? And then he had paper money. Paper money had a better sort of it was a better solution for the scaling aspect again. So as empires started to grow and we started to become more globalized, paper money actually became something a lot better. But it became more of an IOU, right? So the paper money became a reflection or a representation of the gold and silver coins. And so the paper money then was an IOU, saying it's like, okay, I'm going to take this paper money. It represents X number of gold, and that gets distributed. But then in the United States, I believe it was like in the 1970s, the government essentially unpegged the U.S. dollar from gold. And this actually then meant that they had the power and the means to print money at will, or when I say money, paper money. And actually, I should be very careful with my choice of words, because technically paper money is not money, currency, so paper currency. The only real true money is probably gold and silver, because it holds its actual value over time. So paper fiat currency doesn't hold its value over time. It's shown to actually depreciate over time. So anyways, with that, and using the analogy of monopoly again, right? Since things like the U.S. Federal Reserve, central banks around the world, they now had the means to be able to print money at will, and this was the equivalent to monopoly, right? So all this money is literally fake. At least with something like gold, it's something that comes out of the earth, it's finite, etc. But with fiat currency, paper currency, this is actually recreating the world of monopoly right before our eyes. And it has unfortunately increased the wealth gaps between different parts of society. And so we then went to plastic cards, Visa cards, etc., more debt, electronic money, PayPal, and then at the moment right now we've got cryptocurrency a la Bitcoin. So one thing I wanted to share as well is this aspect right here. So let me just go into an alternate view. So here you see this is the messy link between slave owners and modern management. So one thing that was brought to my attention in an IWC chats segment of this show was with Rachel Happy, and she was telling me how it was brought to her attention that looking into sort of the history of slavery, something called amortization, and I'll see if I got that. So let's go amortization. All right. So if you can see here, amortization is the action or process of gradually writing off the initial cost of an asset, right? So let me bring that back and come here. Oops. All right. So yeah, looking at that, why I bring that up is because with amortization, essentially slavery, right? And I'll go through this article. So this Harvard Business School researcher Caitlin Rosenthal made a startling discovery essentially while she was researching business management. So you can see here, she didn't intend to write a book about slavery. She set out to tackle something much more mundane, the history of business practices. What she found was that southern plantation owners kept complex and meticulous records, measuring the productivity of their slaves and carefully monitoring their profits, often using even more sophisticated methods than manufacturers in the north. And this is sort of the downside of a hyper-focus on efficiency, right? Is that it becomes, you start looking at people as assets, right? You start looking at them as numbers, and it actually ruins some of these social contracts, right? If we look at the video that was talked about before, there are these sort of hidden social contracts that take place that capitalistic tendencies and the way that we approach business often neglects to look at because it's not something that's easily recordable. But she sees her research as a critique of capitalism, one that could broaden the understanding of today's business practices. The evolution of modern management is usually associated with good old-fashioned intelligence and ingenuity. But capitalism is not just about the free market. It was also built on the backs of slaves who were literally the opposite of free. So the main question here, right, is like, how much more careful do we need to be? How much more do we need to think about our responsibility to people? And I think this is one of the biggest things that I think capitalism may miss, right, is that if we look at sort of these social contracts, yes, there are legal contracts between business entities, etc. But I think we can agree that there is a price to be paid if you do not look into the health of your people in general. We tend to forget, especially when it comes to business, that at the end of the day, we are serving people, right? And that at the end of the day, the people who are helping you with your business and build your wealth are people. Now, I've heard many arguments, of course, that, you know, if it weren't for the business owners, then there would be no jobs for people to work at and get money. But I think that argument misses the point of that at the end of the day, you are not hiring robots. You are hiring people, right? And so these people are an important part. They have homes, they have families, they have emotions, they have feelings, etc. And you know, if you want robots, well, I mean, that's coming in now, right? So you can get that. You can take out all the emotions. And if you look at the way that we actually try to build and program robots and AI, right, it's like oftentimes we actually try to take out the emotions, right, and the feelings, the things that make humans and people. But the consequence of that is that you make them cold, right? And when you try to make people cold and try to treat them in a cold manner, things like the protests and the riots that you see right now, that's a result, right? When you don't essentially provide warmth, if you want to think of it that way. These things are typically, and a lot of things are changing right now, right? But these things are often overlooked, right? Because it's not easily measurable. And so what we end up having are these inequalities that get widen more and more over time, right, which actually impacts the communities, right? So, and this is actually what makes me so fascinated by economics in general and money. You know, I was never really into economics, although back in school I actually did enjoy it as a subject. It's not something that I look to learn more about right after I graduated. But what I realized and I learned is that, you know, money really does make the world go round, at least in the way that we've built our society right now. And as a result, the economics of many sort of social upheavals or situations, you can, if you trace sort of the money history of those communities, of those you know, social riots, etc., it has everything to do with it, you know. And so, like with the game of Monopoly, you have to look at, you know, why people feel these inequalities, and I mean, this is why I think right now we're sitting at a very crucial period where it's a great reset. Right, we need to be able to reset things, look at what we've done to date, and using the analogy of Monopoly, maybe we might literally need to be like, okay, let's just play another game, because this game of Monopoly actually really sucks for everyone involved. It can be fun every now and then, especially if you're winning, but over time, it actually has really deep psychological effects, right? And so yeah, there's a lot to be learned from this game of Monopoly. Now, you could also argue that monopolies just naturally happen all the time. If you look at the Pareto principle, 80-20, generally, you know, there are certain minorities that actually yield the majority, you know, like we talk about the 1%ers, right? So, again, I think this is all about actually just looking at the game that we're in, unfortunately. And so, yeah, you know, if you are interested in actually learning more about this particular area, I would highly recommend you checking out this book from Caitlin Rosenthal, Accounting for Slavery. So this is, it might be a little bit confronting, but I still would highly recommend it, because it actually makes, it forces you to look at the impact of accounting, of money, of economics on what we are seeing today, you know, many hundreds of years later. And then, yeah, you know, as we were talking about, so let's move into a different view. This is from the New York Times. The article is titled "Behind Virus and Protests, a Chronic U.S. Economic Racial Gap." So in this article, they're essentially talking about, if you look here in this third paragraph, After the upheavals came talk of change, of reforming policing, yes, but also expanding economic opportunity. Black Americans who had been disproportionately left behind in one of the world's richest countries. Yet despite big pledges and high hopes, economic progress has come slowly, if at all, for Black America. And so, this essentially highlights the same analogy of the monopoly stuff, right? So essentially, they're trying to play catch up, right? And I'm actually going to share with you a very interesting video that's been making the rounds, and it is with Morgan Freeman. So let's bring this up. Right now, this is actually a very contrarian view. Let's play it.
Black History Month, you find ridiculous.
You're going to relegate my history to a month? What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month?
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay. Which month is Jewish History Month?
There isn't one.
Oh. Why not? Do you want one?
No.
I don't either. I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man. And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man. I know you as Mike Wallace. You know me as Morgan Freeman.
Black History Month, you find ridiculous.
So, I'm going to pause it there. So, the reason I share this, right, is because, I don't know if it's contrarian, but it's a little bit opposite to what a lot of folks, maybe with Black Lives Matters, might be talking about with sort of the race discussions happening right now. But he's not untrue, like with what he's saying. He's not. I think that there is something to be said about what he's getting at, whereby the way of getting rid of racism is to even acknowledge it, right? There's this story of the fight between the two bulls within us all, right? And essentially, like, the moral of the story is, like, when it comes to doing good or doing evil, which part of you is going to win, and it's essentially whichever part of you feed the most, right? And I think that's a very very apt way of looking at what's happening right now. Is with anti-racism, are we actually perpetuating the issue by talking more about it? But then you could argue also that by raising awareness, you can do something about it, right? Because sometimes there's an ignorance thing taking place. Now, when it comes to Morgan Freeman, he's definitely made it, as a black man in Hollywood and entertainment, and so maybe because he doesn't experience these things as much as maybe other poorer black people do. Because again, even within the black community, you've got the poor, and then you've also got the wealthy, right? So this is where it is a slippery slope when it comes to prejudices in general. So where does it stop? Is it race? Is it gender? Is it your economic status in society? So I can see that side of the argument as well. So let's hop back. So again, if you're interested in learning more sort of about like this history, feel free to go check out this book. I'm sure there are audiobooks available online as well. And yes, again, looking at just the economics to health and what's happening in the world. And I'm sharing this as sort of like a closing slide, because the yin-yang symbol is, I find myself often coming back to it time and time again, right? And the reason why I show this is because even though we could look at the United States having built its wealth on the back of slaves, there have obviously been a lot of good things that have come out as a result, right? There are still many people who are proud of the United States, who are proud of being American. Many great innovative companies have come out as a result. A lot of good has come out of the bad. And the yin-yang symbol kind of talks about this, that like actually when you go to the extreme, the opposite like just instantly is created, right? So, one of the good things was that, yes, okay, slavery might have been used to help build the United States, But then it did. There were a group of people who realized that, hey, this is actually really bad, and we got to do something about it. And so they did. And as a result, they did have the abolishment of slavery, and to help a lot of slaves become free. Now there was the next issue where they made these made slaves free, but they didn't really set them up for success, technically, over time. And so then that sort of perpetuated. But there were a few within those groups who were able to make it, who were able to understand the game, who were able to rise in the ranks, if you want to call it that. And so it's just looking at this again, what we're seeing now. Definitely there are systemic issues. Systems are built by human beings, and so if they are built by us, they can also be destroyed by us. And I think when it comes to capitalism, because it has these blind spots, right, of essentially the people aspect not really being taken into account, I think it leaves open an opportunity for a new form or new system to actually come into play. One that might take lessons from capitalism and socialism and whatever else you want to call it. But I think as we are now in 2020 and we're moving forward, I really strongly feel that there will be a time where we'll see sort of both a new form of money come out and also a new governance type come out. I don't know what it is yet, but I think it's coming. And so with that, as always, remember, through patience and persistence, it will come.